Personne. Parfait. Donc, bonsoir tout le monde. Bienvenue à la première clinique Football 101. So, welcome to the first 101 Football Clinic. Merci beaucoup d'être là encore une fois en si grand nombre. Vous allez être accompagné par un coach d'expérience pour les 4 sessions. Il va y avoir une progression, puis je vais le laisser expliquer le but de ces sessions, puis l'importance que ça a aussi, ces cliniques-là, Football 101. So thanks for joining. This is the first of 4 sessions that will show a nice progression to consolidate your knowledge about football or just learn about the game if you're new to it. So without further delay, I will let the mic I will pass the mic to Sean.
Merci, Andréane. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's doing good. Keeping sane with all the COVID craziness. Alors, ce soir, on va faire Football 101. C'est quelque chose que j'ai déjà fait l'année passée avec les Rebels de Capital ici à Ottawa. So it really is a very, very basic introduction to football. So for some of you with experience, it may be a refresher. Hopefully there's a few things you do learn. You know, an example of something I know just from the session the other night when the coach was speaking about field and boundary, there's a few people who had never called it that, called it strong side, weak side. So hopefully a few little tidbits like that we get to learn. On va faire la session la plupart en anglais, mais on peut prendre des questions en français, puis on peut dire encore comme to reinforce some things en français aussi. But feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. I think, Andréane, you're going to watch for questions and things, or if you don't want to speak on audio, you can always type them in the chat as well. Okay, so I'll start just by sharing my screen, and we'll start with the basic presentation. Okay, so as you all know, we're trying to start up a league that will provide the opportunity for women to play football, tackle football specifically, and I'm super excited about this. It's something that I've actually hoped that we could have in Ontario and Quebec for many years. I've been coaching for over 27 years, and I've always found it a little bit of a shame that in Ontario and Quebec and Central Canada, the largest part of the country, that we have no women's football teams. We have East Coast and West Coast teams that have been around for a minimum of 7 and upwards of 10 years. And c'est temps pour Ontario et Québec de prendre notre place. Alors, so Football 101, what is 12-on-12 football? What is that? Simply is 12 players versus 12 players. So again, a typical game, and I know this may sound simple, but you have Team A's offense that plays against Team B's defense. Team A's defense plays against Team B's offense. And the reason I point this out is that we had some women that were brand new to the sport last year with the Rebels, and they actually weren't really sure how a game occurred. Like, they thought that our offense played against our defense, and then the other team's offense. So again, it sounds kind of funny, but it just to make that clear that we do play one offense against the opposing team's defense, and then the other team's defense against our offense. So something I know Andréane is not determined yet, but we'll either play 3 or 4 downs, and I'll go into exactly what is a down. My preference for women's football would be 4 downs. Just so that it gives that extra down for everyone to experience some success, right? If we only have 3 downs, if you've watched Canadian football, the exchange of the ball between teams can occur very quickly. So we want to be able to offer that opportunity to that. That's my personal opinion on that one. So the first thing I'll start with is just talking about the field. So how big is a field in Canadian football? Now, one of the things I'll also touch on is that quand on fait une recherche sur Google ou quelque chose, la plupart du temps, c'est des choses avec le jeu américain, pas canadien. Okay, so we have to be a little bit careful that when we Google concepts and and field sizes, downs, rules, things like that, it's always going to default and give you American content. It's very difficult to get Canadian content, believe it or not, on Google unless you specify. So there are a lot of differences in the game. The one thing you can 100% Google all the time is skills and drills. And what I mean by skills and drills is if you play defensive line and you want to know how to do a rip or a swim or how to bull rush or something like that, or if you're a receiver and you want to know tricks on how to catch the ball better, those things are universal. You can Google that, and it doesn't matter if it's Canadian or American, that's okay. But just be careful when you're Googling other things with respect to how the game actually functions. There's a big difference between the Canadian and American game. A lot of similarities, but a lot of different things too. So as we look at the field, you'll notice that, again, the difference between Canadian and American is that the Canadian field is much larger. So the first example is that the field is much wider, okay? We are 65 yards wide, and I'll explain some reasons why that is important as we move through. But having it 65 yards wide makes for, in my opinion, a more exciting game because it allows for more room to move, especially at the professional level when the guys are bigger and faster. They can make an American field seem very, very small when they're that big and that fast. So I prefer the wider field myself. We also are a longer field. So for example, if you look where we start 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then in Canadian football, we have a center field or a 55-yard line. In American football, they go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then they start back down again, 50, 40, 30. So we have that extra, basically 10 yards. So our field is truly 110. Le jeu américain, c'est vraiment 100 verges. Pour nous, c'est 110, okay? So the other thing as well is our end zones. Our end zones are much deeper. So they're 20 yards long. So a much deeper, so this comes into play, and these are concepts we can go into later. But when you get down into what we call the red zone, which is from the 20-yard line and in, when we're attempting to score, you have a lot more options with a larger end zone as compared to the American game. So it gives you a lot more space as an offense to run plays, and it also makes it more challenging as a defense to cover a larger space. Okay, so that's the basic difference in terms of our field. One other thing that's interesting is also the goalposts. Okay, so goalposts in Canadian football are at the actual goal line where we'd score a touchdown. In American, it's at the back of the field. So their field goals tend to even though again their end zone is not as long. But it does mean that their field goals can be different, because if we're kicking a field goal from the 30-yard line in Canadian, that is truly 30 plus however far back we go for the holder, so 37 yards. But in American, you have to add on 10 yards to that because their goalpost is 10 yards back in the end zone. It's kind of an interesting difference there. So one other thing that we have in Canadian football that's very different from American is what's called the hash marks. So I'll show you quickly here. Hopefully everyone can see the arrow that I'm pointing right now on the screen. Right here in the middle of the field is what's called hash marks. And what the hash marks really do is they determine, and we'll talk about this, is the strength of the field. So if I was running a play from the middle of the field and I ran and I was tackled on the left-hand side of the field, the referee would typically place the ball on the left hash mark. So now we have clearly, you'll see a shorter side of the field. And then from this hash mark all the way across, we have a much wider field to cover. So this becomes important in your offensive play calling as well as your defensive play calling. So it's something that, if you have a team that's a speed team, they will take advantage of that wider, longer field. And this is where in Canadian football, that 65 yards definitely, comes into play. All right. So these are the hash marks. Again, it's rare in Canadian football that the ball is ever placed on the middle of the field. Okay. So if a play is made in between, like really close to the middle, they may place the ball there, but typically they're always going to bring it to a hash mark. Okay. So there's that. I'll pause really just quickly there just to see if there's any initial sort of questions on anything. Si on a des questions, on peut juste prendre une couple de questions maintenant.
N'hésitez pas à lever votre main ou à écrire dans le chat. Là. On veut vraiment que ces sessions-là soient interactives. Donc, si vous avez des questions, le champ est
Oui,
là.
on peut prendre des questions à la fin aussi, mais si vous avez des questions maintenant, on peut prendre des questions maintenant. OK, we're good?
Oui, il y a une question de Football Québec.
OK.
Hi, Sean. Is there ever a time where a coach gets to decide whether he could put on the left or the right hash mark, or like the strong side or the weak side hash mark? Is there ever a time where he could decide?
Yes. So when there's a penalty on an exchange of the football, so on a kickoff or a punt or something like that, then they can choose. And then a lot of times with field goals, they actually are able then to choose what hash they want based on if the ball was somewhere in the middle, then they can choose what hash. But if the play ended, then that's where they're kicking their field goals from that hash. But there are a few scenarios, and I do touch on the rules as well as part of the presentation. So that's something that we can look at more closely when we hit rules. There is something I probably won't cover tonight exactly, and I will make note of that question and bring it back up again. So very, very good question.
Thank you very much.
That answers your question for now.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else, or are we good for right now? Okay. Okay. So what does a down mean? What does that mean? So again, in CFL football, we typically have 3 downs. In American, we have 4. And so you can, if there's any rugby players out there, we can relate that to it's a try. Okay, so you get a try. It's not quite the same as a try in rugby, but you basically have to get 10 yards. Okay, and again, if we look back at our field, each kind of little tiny line is 1 yard, and 1 yard is kind of like a big giant step. If you picture, that's about 1 yard. Okay, so each mark represents a yard, and then you have a line at 5 yards, and then you usually have your markings are always at the 10, so 10, 20, 30, etc. So in order to get a fresh set of downs or tries, you need to gain 10 yards. You can gain more, but you cannot gain less in order to get a what's called a first down. So, for example, you always start when you first get the ball with a 1st and 10 is what they call it. So for example, on that first down or first try, you gain 5 yards. So now you would be, actually I have a typo in there. You would be 2nd and 5, not 2nd and 10. And then, so at 2nd and 5, then if you gained 6 yards, now you are at a 1st and 10 again. Okay. And there's no limit in a series of how many downs, like how many times you get first downs. As long as you're getting first downs, you go the length of the field until you score, turn over the ball, kick a field goal, what have you. We'll go through all those options. So another example is also that you can lose yards. So if you were 1st and 10 and you lost 5 yards, now you're 2nd and 15. So now your strategy changes a little bit, as does so offensively and defensively. You know, you have 2nd and you have to gain more yards in order to get that first down. And in Canadian football, if you have the 3 downs, now you only have that 2nd down to get 15 yards. If you end up in a 3rd down situation, now you're looking at the choices of either going for it or punting. Okay, and punting is just you're kicking the ball away to the opposing team. We can get into more details about an actual punt. So on that note, you can look at, say, so again, first and 10 situation, and let's say you lost those yards on first down. So now you're 2nd and 15. So as I mentioned, your choices now, if you didn't get, let's say you got 10 yards, now you're 3rd and 5. So now you have a choice. You have a choice of, as I mentioned, punting or going for it. If you go for it, you're risking now turning the ball over to the other team if you don't gain those 5 yards. So let's say on 3rd and 5, you gained 4 yards. You're not gaining a first down. The other opposing team immediately gets the ball where you were down. Okay, so now you're looking at if I go back to the field, now you have decisions where if I was, if I'm trying to score at this end zone and I was close to that end zone, I may want to take that risk as a coach and say, well, we're going to go for it on third down. But if I had the ball way down here in my own zone, or maybe depending on the coach, maybe on this side of the midfield, we may say we're going to punt it away and keep gaining field position because we don't want to give them the ball there. So again, especially if you're down on, like, say, inside the 30-yard line, you may not want to try it on 3rd and 5 or something, because again, you're giving the opposing team the ball right there in a very, very good position. Okay. So I'll open it up for some questions again on downs and distance and things like that, and see if anybody has questions.
Pour l'instant, for now, it's
Good question. Good. Okay, perfect. Okay, so penalties. There are lots of penalties that can be called in a game. And basically a penalty is when somebody breaks a specific rule. It can be on the offense, it can be on the defense, it can be while there's a special teams play. You can even have a penalty that is on the bench, meaning it was somebody, either a player on the bench who said something, did something, or typically us coaches, when we get a little out of control and we yell and scream at the refs, we get ourselves a penalty. So we do our best not to do that as coaches, but sometimes it happens. So typically your most common penalties are either 5 yards or 10 yards. So I'll give an example. So defensively, there's a common penalty called offside. So we have the offense that will snap the ball, and if somebody from the defense crosses the line of scrimmage prior to the ball being snapped, there will be a flag, and it will be called offside. And so at that point, they will apply 5 yards. So going back to my examples of first down, second down, third down, let's say it was 1st and 10, they got an offside penalty, it would now be 1st and 5. So as an offense, you don't lose your down, you still keep your down, and that's part of the penalty that the defense gets, is now you need 5 less yards to get another first down, and it remains first down. It doesn't automatically go to second down, okay? Now, part of that as well is that a coach, on some penalties, the play still happens. They don't always whistle the play dead, okay? Offside on the defense usually is one of those where if they go offside, the play continues. So let's say the offense did gain, say, 8 yards. So now the coach has a choice. Do I want to be 1st and 5, or do I want to be 2nd and 2? So at that point, there's a little bit of a discussion and some strategy. What are we going to do there? And each coach will have their rhyme or reason why they will either what's called decline the penalty or take the penalty, accept the penalty. Okay. So again, you can imagine that anytime a penalty occurs, it affects the play calling by the offensive coach and the defensive coach, right? So for example, a holding penalty on the offense, and we'll go through what some of these penalties are in more detail, but a holding penalty would be now a 10-yard penalty on the offense. So now if it was 1st and 10, now you're looking at 1st and 20. So now that changes the approach for both sides of the ball, right? Offense and defense, as to what's going to happen. Again, the choice there is that the defense can now decline that penalty, and they can make it, if it was 1st and 10, instead of making it 1st and 20, they could make it 2nd and 10. So sometimes that depends on the offense. So for example, if you have a high-powered offense, you don't want to give them opportunity to be on the field any longer than they should be. So some coaches on a very high-powered offense will say, we're declining that penalty. We're okay with them having to get 10 yards. We're going to put them in 2nd down, so they only have one more try to get to 3rd down to get those 10 yards. So a coach may feel more comfortable with them only getting 10 yards versus giving them 2 opportunities to get 20 yards, okay? So I'm going to leave penalties and come back to it in another session just because there's so many, but you can look up all the rules through this link. Adrian, I'm not sure if maybe you can share that link in the chat or something so everybody can just click on it and go look at the rules. And then next session, once people have had a chance to read those rules, then we can go through each penalty and describe what they are and describe what they mean, okay? Because for us to jump on and do penalties right now too in depth will cause a lot of other questions that we haven't quite learned about the game just yet, okay? So let's talk about positions on a team, okay? So we'll start with offensive positions. So there are groups of positions in each offense and defense, as well as special teams. And then there are specific positions in those groups. So for example, offensive line has typically 5 players that are there. There is the center. There's what's called the guards. There are 2 guards, and they're on either side of the center. And then you have the tackle, which is then beside the guards. So if you picture it, center, 2 guards, and then 2 tackles, okay? And I'll just say this one thing. Il y a beaucoup des noms dans football qui est masculin, okay? Comme offensive lineman, defensive lineman, okay? C'est quelque chose que certaines personnes, peut-être, ils ne veulent pas dire le mot man ou men. Il y a des autres qui ne ça dérange pas. For me, I follow your lead. You are the women in this sport who are leading the way. If you want to change names and develop your own names as to what it's called, if you want to call it an offensive line women, if you want to just call it offensive line, whatever you come up with, I feel it's up to you to do. I feel that it shouldn't be up to guys or the old school football people to determine this for you. You should carve out your own niche and your own way on this and decide what is the right way to call these positions in terms of that. I'm not saying change the entire position, like, not call it offensive line anymore, call it something. I'm saying like removing certain masculine references to the game. Okay, so I feel that that's important, and so I'll follow anybody's lead who wants to come up with ideas for that. So just so you know, now by habit, I may still say things like offensive linemen and defensive linemen. I do myself to just kind of shorten it and say offensive line, defensive line now, but I may still default to it because après 27 ans, I've got some habits. Okay, so you picture that, again, you have the center, the 2 guards, the tackles, and they are 5 players that must be on what's called the line of scrimmage. The line of scrimmage is where the ball is placed, okay? So we have the line of scrimmage, the ball is placed, and then you have your offensive line. And then on the other side is the defense, okay? We'll go through that in a moment. And the defense must be what we call 1 yard away in Canadian football. In American football, there is no 1 yard. They're almost nose to nose, okay? So then we usually have positions called running backs and fullbacks, or that the name fullback has evolved to be what's called an H-back in more current Canadian climate, but traditionally it's still something called a fullback. So typically a fullback is a larger player who can do blocking as well as catching, as well as running the ball. They're a little more multifaceted, and running backs are usually slightly smaller players, but really very like good speed, good vision, and are able to run the ball very well. That's traditional. It doesn't mean to say it has to be just that, but that is traditionally what they do. So you in what's called the backfield, so in behind the offensive line, you have these running backs. And then, of course, you do have the quarterback back there, which I don't list. So I need to change that. And then you'll have your receivers. So if we count 12 players and we reduce by 5, and then we reduce for the quarterback, and then we reduce by 2 running backs, we're at 7. Okay. That leaves us with the potential of having 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yes, 5, 6, 7, 8. Sorry, 4 receivers. My bad. So that leaves us the opportunity to have 4 receivers. So normally we have 2 receivers that are very wide on the field, called wide receivers, and then 2 receivers that are closer to the line and closer to the offensive line, and they're called slot backs. Okay. A lot of times, every coach will name them differently, but we have typically a lot of times you'll call them W, X, Y, and Z receivers. Okay. So one rule that we want to always follow is with our offensive line is this: the offensive line plus 2 other players. Can be a running back who comes up to the line. It could be one of the receivers, but we have to have always 7 players on the line of scrimmage. Okay, in Canadian football. If you don't, it is a penalty, and those 7 players must remain motionless. Okay, everybody else can move in motion. All right. So again, that's a general. It is the rule, not a general rule, where you must have those 7 people. If you don't have the 7, you're automatically going to get a flag and a penalty. So when we look at formations, the offense can have a variety of formations, so long as what I call my rule of 7 is followed. So 7 players motionless on the line of scrimmage before the snap of the ball. Okay. So an example I'm giving here is you can have 3 receivers, say on one side, 2 on the other, and then your quarterback and running back in the backfield. And then you can also have additional players on the line of scrimmage. You can have more than 7. It doesn't have to just be 7. You could have an 8th on the line, and you're okay. Then there's also one other player that we haven't really talked about, and that's called a tight end. So a tight end is not traditionally used a lot in Canadian football, but they are somebody that can go on the line of scrimmage with the offensive line, and they can either block or catch the ball, or they could even run. In certain circumstances, they could come behind the line of scrimmage and take a handoff and run. So those are examples of a lot of the different players and things we can have. So reviewing all those players. So again, we have the center who snaps the ball. We have 2 guards, 2 tackles. They consist of 5 offensive line that don't move until the ball is snapped. And then we always have to have at least 2 others to make up our 7 that are on the line and not moving. So oftentimes you'll see receivers in a game, they'll get to the line of scrimmage and they'll raise their hand and look at the referee who is closest to the sideline they're on. And what they're doing is they're just making sure with the referee that they are actually physically on the line. Because if you're looking down the line of scrimmage, sometimes it's hard. Let's say it's a muddy field or a snowy field, or the lights are in your eyes. It's hard to see if you're exactly on. So it's always best to check in with the ref and just say, am I on? And they'll tell you yes, no, back up, move forward, what have you, and to make you exactly on the line. So I'll stop there again, just to field a few more questions. Is there any questions on what we just sort of went through?
All is good for now.
Okay, parfait. Okay. I'm just going to skip over a few things here. I want to skip over some offensive stuff and just come to defensive stuff. Just bear with me. Okay, so we flip to the defensive side of the ball. So defensively, there's a million things you can do in terms of formations. Generally, we call a defense by the first number is always going to be by how many defensive line players you have. Then the next number will be how many linebackers you have. And then the next will be how many defensive backs you have. So going through that, so we have defensive line can have a multitude of names. So I'll show you what I named them, but you can go look at any playbook from any coach and they'll all have different names that they will call those defensive players. Generally though, so a traditional defense a lot of people run is what's called a 4-3 defense, which means 4 defensive line, 3 linebackers. And then again, if we're playing 12 players, that leaves us with 5 defensive backs. What is the purpose of each position? Again, a D line is somebody who is on that line of scrimmage where going against the 5 offensive line players. Okay, so they are typically on the line. They're either in a 2 or a 3-point stance. Okay, we can touch on stances and things that probably with some of the other sessions. And this is what we would identify as what's called a front. You'll hear that word, a front. So the front means how many downline players there are. So again, if it's a 4-3, we call it a 40 front. If it's a 3-4, if there are 3 down line, 4 linebackers, we would call it a 30 front. If there were 5 down line, we would call it a 50 front. Okay, so you're just identifying, you know, how many D line are there first, and then how many linebackers, how many defensive backs. So what is the job of a defensive line player? Typically, defensive line player has 2 jobs. They're responsible for stopping the run. So when there's a running play, they're expected to get off of the block of the offensive line player and make a tackle. And then they are also responsible for rushing to the quarterback when there's a passing play and trying to either disrupt the pass, block it, knock it down, get their hands in the eyes of the quarterback, or do what's called a quarterback sack, which is where they tackle the quarterback for a loss. So that is the main goal. Defenses do get very more complex, where defensive line players will actually drop back into coverage, things like that. So we won't touch on that today. That's a lot more advanced. Just know though that anything goes, right? However creative a defensive coordinator can get, there's no real rules there. It's not like on offense where you have to have those 7 people motionless on the line of scrimmage. Defense, I could put all 12 players up on the line of scrimmage. I could put 2 on the line of scrimmage. I could put 5. I can put whatever I want. Okay. So a little bit of an advantage there in terms of defense, that they get to have show those different kind of looks. What do linebackers do? Linebackers, traditionally, their first role is to read the run and then support in pass. Okay, so they will take what's called a read step, and they will read to see whether it's a running play or not, and then they will go and attack and try to make a tackle on whoever's carrying the ball. And then if it's a passing play, then they will then drop back into their coverage, and they will be responsible for that. Defensive backs. So again, traditionally, there's always 5 in Canadian football. Again, that can change, but traditionally, that's what you're going to see. Because in Canadian football, we are a little more of a pass-oriented league because of the fact that we only have 3 downs. So we need to gain those yards a little quicker. And if we're only running, then it can make it difficult, right? So we tend to pass a little bit more in Canadian football. Not saying that we don't run in Canadian football, just that we do have a lot more passing flavor because of the 3 downs. So this is why, for me, if we moving forward with a women's league, that we should work off of 4 downs, because it gives us more opportunity to do plays that are both running and passing and giving true experience to both sides of the ball, right? So again, the defensive back's primary job is to cover receivers and make sure that receivers don't catch a pass. And if they do catch a pass, that they tackle them as quickly as possible so that they don't gain extra yards or run for a touchdown. So names of positions, again, these can vary greatly. Okay, so we talked. I had mentioned it in the introduction about field and boundary. So if I go back to my field for a moment, so again, If the ball was placed on this hash mark, the short side or weak side is what a lot of people traditionally call that. And then the wide side of the field would be called the strong side. So we want to replace those words with what we use at professional and university levels to make it clear. And the same message is that the wide or strong side is called the field, and the short or weak side is called the boundary. Okay, so field, wide side, boundary. Again, if the ball was on the opposite hash, that switches. Now the short or weak side becomes the boundary, and that wide side becomes the field. Okay, so it all depends on which side of the field is wider. It's going to be very obvious when you're out there on the field. Again, because it's 65 yards wide, you're going to see one side of the field is obviously wider than the other. Okay, so if we look at that rule and we go back in terms of positions, so again, like I said, position names can change vastly on defense. It all depends on the coach, but traditionally, what I like to use is the terminology as follows. So on the field side, defensive end, so that is a defensive line player, and they are what we call the defensive end, is that they're the last player on that defensive line. Okay, so they would probably be lined up somewhere around where the offensive tackle is. Okay, I like to call them the rush. Okay, on the boundary side, defensive end, so again, the opposite side in front of the opposite tackle, I like to call them the quick. The field side defensive tackle, so that your tackles are usually interior linemen or inside line, and that's somewhere between inside of the tackles usually. Okay, so either gap, in the gap, we'll talk about gaps soon, but in the gaps of like where the guard and the tackle is, or in the gap between the center and the guards, or head up, there's a variety of things they can do. So again, the field side defensive tackle, I like to call them the nose tackle, and the boundary side defensive tackle, I like to call them just a pure defensive tackle. Then we have what's our linebackers. So you have the middle linebacker. There are a bunch, again, a bunch of names you can call. You can call it a Mike linebacker, you'll hear it called, or a Mac linebacker. Okay. Mike seems to be the trend right now, that people call the Mike linebacker. So they are truly in the middle of the field, and their responsibility is that inside running game, and then their secondary responsibility is the pass. Then we have the field side outside linebacker. So again, they are closer outside to where like the offensive tackle is, or where our rush or our quick are. So the field side, again, being the strong side, we like to call them the Sam linebacker. And on the boundary side linebacker, we like to call them the Will linebacker. Okay. And the only reason in terms of those names is simply that it kind of rhymes, right? So strong, Sam, weak, Will. It's easy to remember, right? Then you get your defensive backs. And typically at defensive backs, we have on the far outside where the wide receivers are, we have what are called corners. And then inside of that, where the slot backs are, we have what are called halfbacks. And then a middle player who's in there called the free safety. This is where things get very different if you Google American football, is that they only have the 11 players. So they usually have only 4 defensive backs in there, unless they've added in another defensive back in a certain situation where they know it's going to be a pass. But on a regular down, they are going to only have 4. They call them corners, and then they have a strong safety and a free safety. Okay, just so, again, if you Google and you're asking about football questions about defensive backs, you are probably going to find American information first, not Canadian. So just be careful on that. Okay. So here's what it all looks like. Okay. So again, we have the center, the 2 guards, the 2 tackles, our quarterback, fullback, running back, and then we have our wide receivers and our slot backs. Okay. Now this is a very traditional style. What you see a lot of right now is that the quarterback is standing back about where I've got the fullback, and they bring that fullback out as a 3rd receiver, and there's only 1 running back there. And so we'll get into terminology on that, but that's called shotgun, and we'll get into that maybe tonight. I don't know. And then you look again defensively. So again, we've got, the defensive tackle, the nose tackle, the rush, the quick. That's our defensive line. You have Will, Mike or Mac, and Sam. Those are your linebackers. You have your corners, your halfbacks, and then your free safety. Okay. Adriana, I don't know how we're doing for time. If we want to open it up for questions, and I should stop there, or do you want me to continue?
We have until 8:45, 8:50. If everybody's good with that, and we'll continue until then and open for questions.
Okay, around that's a minute. Okay, good. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll go back and identify, I talked about the word gaps, okay? So I'll touch on that defensively. We'll come back to some other basic concepts of offense on another night. But if we look, so you have your center, your two guards, your tackle. Defensively, we typically will call in between the center and the guard, regardless of what side of the field it is. We'll call that the A gap. Okay, so the gap is the space between the center and the guard. Then we have the guard and the tackle. The space between them is what's called the B gap. And then outside of the tackle, we call that the C gap. And then super wide of that, we call the D gap. Okay. Same thing on the other side. We have A, B, C, and D gap. So when I say to you, for example, if I were to say, okay, the quick, your responsibility is B gap. So that's the first place you'd be heading as that player, is to the B gap. Okay. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that we can touch on other evenings as to how you read and what you do. You don't just go there and stand there and do nothing. You would obviously read and try to make a play, and you're shedding blocks and all kind of fun stuff. But your first responsibility when someone tells you, okay, you in this position, you have B gap responsibility. That's what they mean. Okay. Is that you have the responsibility to control and own that gap. Okay. There's lots of ways to do it, but that's the basics of it. Okay. I like to number the backs in the backfield. Okay. Quarterback will always be what we call the one back. Okay. Fullback would be a two back. Running back would be a three back. Okay. If we get into a scenario where they have one of that fullback is out as a receiver, then we would identify them with another name. We'll get to that another time. But we would still call the running back the three back at that point, okay? Because they still are the three back, okay? So again, when we want to identify certain things, that's what we would want to do, is just kind of number those backs, okay? So we have our gaps, we have our numbered backs, and then we have some letters X, Y, W, and Z for our receivers. Okay, so this is an example of everybody who would have gaps, okay, and how to control our gaps. So we're assuming here that this would just be a running play, no passing right now, okay? So again, this can change depending on the defensive coordinator. Every play called, every defensive coordinator's playbook will have something different. This is just what we would call a base defense that is a simple one to look at. It's not necessarily what everybody will use. It's a good way to start so that you just understand what gap control means. Okay. So for this example, we have the rush end. They're playing C gap, and Will, the weak side or field or boundary side, linebacker, is playing C gap. The quick defensive end is playing B gap. The defensive tackle is playing A gap. The Mac or Mike, whatever you want to call him, is got the A gap to the field. The nose tackle has the B gap to the field. Sam is reading inside for support, but then has D gap, or what we call contain. All right. And then everybody else has got outside containment as defensive backs on a running play. Okay. You never want anyone to get outside of you. because again, when a running back or somebody carrying the ball gets out here, you have less and less support, right? So if they have somebody who's really speedy, gets out here really fast, the players in here may not get there in time. So when you're kind of on an island here alone, you want to push them back to your support inside. So again, if the ball was running this way, everybody would be running this way. If you let them get outside of you, right, then you have no support. If you force them back inside, now you have the support of those players running to you, okay? So now we're touching a little bit on the basic concepts of what a defense will do, all right? And free safety, one of my favorite positions, because oftentimes they call it a free safety because you're truly free, all right? So they have this, they have the ability to be following the flow of the play, all right? Whether it's run or pass. And then again, here in a run situation, it's nice because they just follow the ball. So if they see the ball going this way, they just attack and go. The nice part about a free safety is that, again, you don't have any actual gap control. So you just run in and headhunt and go knock someone's head off, which is always fun. So one of my personal favorite positions, free safety. I'm a little bit biased there, even though I was a corner when I played, but I always wanted to play free safety. So that's the basics of how we would control gaps and control, prevent a team from running. Okay, so if everybody does their job in here and we eliminate all these gaps, there should not really be anywhere for them to run. Now, obviously, the offense has different ideas and they want to run the ball. So they're going to do different things, and we can get into offensive concepts and things like that later. But they will develop plays that they know where they might, put two blockers on one person and creates a hole. Right. So if you get what's called a double team, two blockers on you, then it makes it more difficult for you to control your gap. Right. So this is where you need support of your other players around you. So this is where, for me, and this is what I'll end on before questions, this is why football is the most team-oriented sport in the world for me, is because you can't do it all by yourself. You can be the best athlete, the best player, the best tackler, the best whatever. And if you don't have 11 other people who are helping you, you will do nothing. So again, if my will linebacker is a superstar and they should be playing in the pros, but hey, if you have two people come out and block them, well, sometimes they'll make plays, but sometimes they won't. It's kind of 50-50. So you have to rely on everybody else doing their job to support somebody else, right? And so sometimes in football, and we can touch on this more before I end, sometimes we actually have a job, offensively or defensively, where we sacrifice ourselves in order to have a play work. So I'll give you an example. Played for Team Ontario. I was playing outside linebacker. I was a little bit undersized, and we're playing against Team BC, and they had a massive offensive tackle. He was like pro size, 6'6", 340 pounds. I'm 5'9", I'm like 185 pounds, right? There's no way I'm winning that battle every day, but everywhere that guy went, they ran a play. So if he played tackle, they ran. If he played tackle the other side, they ran to his side. If he played guard, they ran where he was. No matter where he was, he went. So my job was to follow him and to cut block him, take his knees out and create a big pile every play. So it wasn't a good game for me statistically. I didn't make any tackles. I didn't make any plays, but guess what? We won, and we stopped their offense because all of my other teammates, because of what I sacrificed, were able to make plays. And so this is why, for me, football is the true team sport. Okay. So I'll end it there, and we can take questions.
Thanks a lot, Sean. So if you have questions, you can either raise your hand on the Zoom app or write them in the chat. We'll wait a couple of seconds or minutes for you to do that. Also, Sean, I wanted to mention that some players attending tonight really appreciate the inclusivity in the football language you suggest. So thank you for that.
No problem.
Really appreciate that.
No problem. I think it's very, very important. So.
Awesome. Do you want do you want me to give your email address if players have questions?
Sure.
After this session, I can put it in
Absolutely.
the chat.
Yep.
Oops. And the link also for game rule penalties, enfin, les pénalités de la CFL sont dans le chat aussi. I think you can use that as a little assignment, all of you attending today. Read on that. Donc, allez lire ça. Ça va vous donner une bonne idée de ce qu'il en est. Puis, ça va permettre à Sean de faire un suivi aussi à la prochaine session. Je vois que Florence a une question. Est-ce que tu veux la poser?
Me? Yeah, hi.
Sure.
Kind of a funny question I had. I know, of course, in the same team, you know, we play defense and then after we play offense. Do all the players get to play offensive and defensive side, or do you have like one particular position that you have to keep, like you're just on defense and other players are just on the offensive side?
Ideally, if you have enough players, alors si on a comme 36 joueurs sur une équipe, on a des joueurs qui vont jouer juste une seule position. You become an expert in that position. Sometimes if you're, a really, really gifted athlete, a coach may move you in different positions. But typically, if you have enough players, you want to focus and have a defensive unit and an offensive unit. And so again, because there's so much to learn, and especially if we're new to the game, trying to have people play both can become very confusing, right? With all the concepts. But again, there's no rules that say you can't play both. Okay. That's the important part, is there's no rules. So again, it all becomes a coaching decision. Do they have somebody who can understand both sides of the ball, and can they athletically play both sides of the ball? For me, with teams that are developing, and especially for women developing in the sport, yes, we want to give women an opportunity to try many positions. At the end of the day, though, you're still going to be suited to a certain position, right? So if you're somebody who doesn't run fast, let's just say, or if you don't run as fast as somebody else, then you may play a certain position versus somebody who plays a position that typically requires speed, right? If you're, 90 pounds and we ask you to play offensive line, probably not a good idea, So we want somebody who has, a bit of a bigger build or stronger, and again, size doesn't always matter. Again, I was an undersized player my entire career, but you make up for it with, technique, with aggression, really a big one. And with knowledge, knowing the game. So the smarter you can be about the game, you can put yourself in a better position to still make plays, even if somebody else is bigger than you, right? So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Super. Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui a une question à poser ce soir?
So I have a question, and that's based on everyone who attended this evening. I know that we have a lot of people who have some experience, some who don't have experience. I don't know if we can maybe take a few comments now, but if you would like to send comments to Andréan and just say, we need to move this ahead more and get more complicated, or we need to scale it back, or we're at a good pace, please provide that feedback. I don't want anyone to get left behind, but I also don't want, if some experienced players are bored, I don't want them to be, twiddling their thumbs and bored. So by all means, just provide that feedback and let us know, how much more advanced you want to get. Yeah, so I think that's sort of my question. Again, I don't know if anybody wants to answer now, or we can answer later by email back to Andréan or what have you.
Oui, vous pouvez toujours me réécrire par courriel si vous le souhaitez. Si tu me permets, Maud, de partager ton commentaire. Donc, that even for experienced players, it is good to have a little refresh after a long time not playing, especially this year and the past years. So
Absolutely.
you explained well the basics. She really appreciates that. So
Merci. OK, c'est bon. Gal, I've attended NFL camps before as a coach, as a guest coach, and you walk into there and you feel intimidated as a coach because you say, oh my God, they're going to be teaching things so big, high level. The first 20 to 30 minutes of even an NFL practice is all on the basics. It's on stance. It's on blocking, tackling, catching. You know, the game doesn't change no matter what level you go at. It gets more complex and it gets complicated and it gets into like a chess match. But at the end of the day, it's who blocked better, who tackled better, who caught better, right? These things don't change in the game of football. So we have to focus on those basics and make sure that we are experts at those basics, right? Standing beside Bill Belichick blew my mind, but the things out of his mouth were no different than I would tell a little 8-year-old kid who's playing football. That was his first things. Yes, they progress faster, but he started out with basics. It was all about the basics and the small little details.
So well said. So on that, we'll continue. Don't hesitate to give your feedback. Next Wednesday is O-line and D-line, so that will be un bon complément. I don't know the word in English, a complement. To what we saw today. Donc, n'hésitez pas à inviter des gens qui veulent découvrir le sport aussi. Des filles, des femmes, des garçons. C'est super important. Comme Sean l'a dit, the basics, avoir la même terminologie, c'est la clé pour bâtir des équipes durables, puis avec un bon niveau de jeu plus tard, puis de le faire de manière sécuritaire. Donc, c'est super important. Merci encore de votre présence.
Merci tout le monde.
Je souhaite à tout le monde une super belle soirée et on se voit tous et toutes mercredi. Mercredi à 8h également.
Merci tout le monde.
Merci.
Merci.